We're living in a fascist state. It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We're going to be appealing this scam.
The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury. We should all be thankful for the careful attention that this jury paid to the evidence and the law.
Former President Donald Trump, now the first former president in history to be convicted of a felony. Last night, Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Those charges were related to hush money payments made to adult film actress Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 presidential election. The trial consisted of 20 full days of testimony, 22 witnesses in all, only 2 of which were called by the defense. It marks the 3rd case the former president has lost in recent months, including a civil fraud case and the defamation and sexual assault suit brought by E. Jean Carroll, all of which happened in New York. Now, earlier this morning, Trump spoke at Trump Tower in Manhattan. That's where we find our courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, Trump was off the teleprompter during the speech, kind of rambling about different politics, criticizing the judge, the prosecutor, President Biden. Anything that stood out?
Yeah, I mean, I just got back from Trump Tower, and he spoke for about half an hour, really going through what has been his campaign's greatest hits. You heard it right there in the clip, again, calling this trial in this case rigged. He again went after the judge, but also for much of that 33 minutes or so, he was talking about things completely unrelated to the case. He brought up the border, and he brought up Joe Biden attacking him and really making this more than just a press conference following the verdict. At times, it felt like I was at a Trump campaign rally. There was a swarm of media there in the lobby of Trump Tower watching him. But on the other side of the room was a crowd of Trump Organization employees who was actually cheering him on as he was listing off things like his poll numbers and the massive fundraising haul that he's been bringing in since last night's verdict. So a very unusual press conference, like I said, where he's not just talking about this trial, but really turning his own lobby into a campaign rally.
Yeah, and in that speech, as I said, he railed against the judge in the case and even his former fixer, Michael Cohen. Take a listen.
I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put 2 sentences together. This man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. This was a highly qualified lawyer. Now, I'm not allowed to use his name because of the gag order. But, he's a sleazebag. Everybody knows that.
Trump said it several times there himself. He is still under a gag order by the judge in this case. Is there a chance that he violated that here?
I think some of his remarks certainly started to walk up to the line of that gag order, which, as you mentioned, is still in place despite the fact that we do have a verdict. We are still waiting to see whether the judge in the coming days will either change the terms or lift it entirely. But as of now, Donald Trump is prevented from making public statements about witnesses concerning their involvement in this case. And I think you saw it right there in the clip. It's notable that he didn't actually use Michael Cohen's name, but certainly calling him a sleazebag, an attack that we've heard from Donald Trump use against Michael Cohen in the past. I don't think there was a whole lot of doubt about who he was talking about. But in terms of whether he violated it, it seems unlikely at this point that prosecutors are going to come up with a new motion saying that they believe that Donald Trump should be held in contempt of court again, now that the fact that this trial is over. So they haven't filed a motion yet to try to seek a ruling that he has violated the gag order, but in theory, they still could.
Zach, take us inside the courtroom last night. At first, it seemed like jurors were not going to have a verdict yesterday. Then all of a sudden they did. Give us a sense of what it was like in the courtroom during this whirlwind and then as the verdict was delivered.
Yeah, the timing really came as a shock. We got to 4:15 p.m. yesterday afternoon. The judge came into the courtroom and he said, I'm going to dismiss the jury at 4:30. We're going to knock on their deliberation room door and tell them to go home. But 5 minutes after that happened, the jury foreperson signed a note saying, quote, "We, the jury, have reached a verdict." When that news got to the courtroom, the atmosphere immediately changed. Trump had seemed to think that he was going home too. And we actually saw him laughing with his attorney. But once the judge notified them that there was indeed a verdict, all of a sudden Trump's mood changed. He crossed his arms. He was whispering with his attorney, seeming a little bit more nervous. And then he sat there for about 20 or 30 minutes as the jury filled out the verdict sheet before they came into the courtroom. As they came in and out of the courtroom, they walk across the front of the room right past the defense table, but none of the 12 New Yorkers looked at Donald Trump. They were either looking at the ground or pretty much anywhere else except looking at the defendant as they were walking in to go convict him. In terms of the actual verdict reading itself, it was quite quick. The foreperson of the jury went through all 34 counts in only about 2 minutes, just listing one count right after the other. guilty, 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 guilty. So it came really rapid. And Trump was just sitting in his chair, largely motionless. And I even saw him at one point closing his eyes.
Let's talk about the next step. Sentencing set for July 11th, and Judge Merchan isn't going to hold Trump until then. Is he free to do whatever he wants? He's been saying that he wants to get back to campaigning.
Yeah, at this point, he now no longer has to be in this New York courtroom for 4 days a week. So he is now free to, go back on the campaign trail during the week until this sentencing date. I do expect that there's going to be a flurry of activity between now and July 11th. Each side is likely going to submit a memorandum indicating what they believe the sentence should be. We've already seen each side, starting to signal what they're going to do. Trump's team has already signaled that they do not believe that he should be facing jail time for this conviction. And then prosecutors, on the other hand, when I was at Alvin Bragg's press conference last night, where he was asked about whether they would be seeking jail time for the former president, he declined to answer the question and said that his office would be speaking through court filings. There is a series of motions deadlines the judge has set up over the next month or so. So we're waiting to see what comes out in those court filings in terms of the sentencing. But as of now, Trump can go back out on that campaign trail.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the prosecution pushes for here. But when it does come to sentencing, what is the conventional wisdom as to what Trump might be facing?
The conventional wisdom is that he's likely to not face jail time because of the fact that he is a first-time offender. He has no criminal record up until now. And we've looked through, cases where, other defendants who have been charged with these counts of falsifying business records, many of first-time offenders who are charged under this statute don't end up being incarcerated. They're either fined or they have some other lesser punishment. So the conventional wisdom would hold that, statistically, Trump would be more likely than not to not face jail time. That being said, there is precedent for a first-time offender on these charges to face jail time. So it's certainly on the table. These are Class C felonies that each of the 34 counts can carry a few years in jail. So it certainly is going to be a debate that we're going to see unfold between now and July 11th. Like I said, it does seem unlikely that this is going to end in a prison sentence.
Now, these aren't the only charges Trump faces. He also has 2 federal cases regarding his attempts to overturn the 2020 election and his handling of classified documents. There's also an election interference case in Georgia. Is there any chance that any of those cases go to trial before the November election?
It's possible, but it is looking increasingly unlikely. A lot of these cases are pretty much in a holding pattern right now. A lot of this is riding on what the Supreme Court does. They currently are weighing Trump's appeal of his immunity argument that came out of the D.C. case where he's charged over the 2020 election. And so we're waiting to see what the Supreme Court does. The next set of Supreme Court rulings will be next Thursday, so that's the next possible day we could see them rule. And then once they rule one way or the other, saying Donald Trump does have immunity or he doesn't, that is going to be the key thing that could potentially keep alive any chance of these cases going to trial before the election. But like I said, the time is just simply running out between now and November. So that window is simply narrowing by the day.
All right. Thanks so much, Zach. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The guilty verdict is sending reverberations across the political world. Here's what President Biden had to say this afternoon.
The American principle that no one is above the law was reaffirmed. The justice system should be respected, and we should never allow anyone to tear it down. It's as simple as that. That's America. That's who we are. And that's who we'll always be, God willing.
Here to discuss the reaction is The Hill's national politics reporter, Julia Manchester. Julia, what else did the president say about the verdict, and how do we think the Biden camp will use that on the campaign trail?
Yeah, well, Drew, essentially the president said that Trump's response to the verdict, claiming it was rigged against him, was dangerous, in Biden's words, and irresponsible. Now, we saw yesterday that right after the verdict, the Biden campaign put out a statement essentially saying no one is above the rule of law. But Biden himself was quite quiet. Now, that wasn't just by coincidence. Yesterday was also the 9th anniversary of his son Beau's passing. So Biden traditionally has not made any public comments or held public events on, that day in particular. But going forward, I think the Biden campaign is certainly going to paint the Trump campaign and Trump himself as someone who essentially brings chaos to wherever he goes, and try to pitch this idea of normalcy, similar to what they did in 2020, essentially painting Joe Biden as the normal candidate and Trump, who is the literal convicted felon, running for president.
Let's talk about the reaction from Republicans. It's probably no surprise that the MAGA wing of the Republican Party is standing by Trump, but even Republicans that have publicly split with Trump in the past are criticizing this case. How unified is the Republican Party in its messaging that this prosecution was political?
I think the Republican Party is very unified. In fact, a number of GOP strategists I talked to yesterday and today have essentially said that this case is baseless, that if you ask people what the charges were and the, circumstances around the charges, you get muddled answers. So they essentially argue that this case was political, pointing to how Alvin Bragg campaigned on wanting to, prosecute Trump and go after Trump. Remember, a district attorney is obviously a elected position. So they're saying that this is political by design ahead of the November of election. And, you see Republicans, I think, unifying around this because they know that Trump is obviously the presumptive Republican nominee. He's going to have impacts that reverberate up and down the ballot in November. So I think this is definitely a move to unify and a chance, really, an opportunity for Republicans to point to a state like New York, a city like New York City, and say, this is a liberal bastion. Of course, they found a former Republican president who's a presumptive Republican nominee for president this cycle guilty.
Now, before the verdict, former Maryland governor and current Senate candidate Larry Hogan, a moderate Republican, dared to say that leaders should respect the jury's decision and rule of law. Chris Lasavita, former Trump advisor who's now running day-to-day operations at the RNC, reacted on X saying, "You just ended your campaign." Is that the kind of pressure Republicans are facing to fall in line and back Trump?
There is that pressure, but I think Larry Hogan and Maryland are a very different test case going forward. Remember, earlier this week, you saw Larry Hogan release an ad talking about how, abortion rights must be protected in the U.S. and in Maryland, and that women should have control over their own bodies. So that's an example of how Larry Hogan, running in a very deep blue state as a Republican, has been pitching himself as a moderate. And I think this is another example saying the jury should be respected is also another way that he's pitching himself as a moderate. Now, in terms of whether this is the nail in the coffin for Hogan's campaign, I think that's very unclear. We're talking about this at the end of May. The general election is in November, so a lot can happen between now and then. And if you look at the priorities that Maryland voters are thinking of and U.S. voters in general are thinking of when they go to the ballot box, it's not Trump's guilty verdict. It's on issues like inflation, the economy, abortion, crime, healthcare. The list goes on. So, this is definitely the needle that Hogan is threading as a Republican running in Maryland. But, I'm sure he expected to get that pressure from, his, opponents. I don't want to say opponents, but fellow Republicans who aren't really from the same wing of the party that he is.
And sparring with Trump's people could actually maybe benefit Hogan in a state like Maryland. But I want to get back to Trump using this guilty verdict to raise money for his presidential run. The Trump campaign announcing it brought in nearly $40 million in small donations since yesterday. It doesn't appear that the verdict is scaring off Trump's financial supporters.
No, and this is huge. I mean, I've only been covering presidential candidates since 2016, but I think even going back before then, we haven't seen anything like this. And this was in less than 24 hours. Now, I haven't gotten a chance, and I don't know if these figures are available, but to go into those small dollar donations to see how many new donors there are, for example, what was the average size of the donation? That's obviously all very important. But this is a big deal for the Trump campaign because we've seen that in recent months, there has been this fundraising race between Trump and Biden, and the Democrats have a very well-oiled fundraising machine right now, while Trump and the RNC have been paying for these legal battles that he's been facing. So the fact that they were to raise this amount of money is very important. But want to caution that, what's important here is that if this money is from Trump's donors going back to 2016 and 2020, that's obviously great. But if he was able to bring in new donors since the verdict came out on Thursday evening, that would be big because I think it goes to show that, the verdict is having an impact outside of his immediate base.
Now, we're also hearing from independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He called the verdict profoundly undemocratic and something that will backfire on Democrats. With Kennedy, the big question is whether his candidacy helps Biden or Trump. Through that prism, how should we view Kennedy's reaction to the verdict?
Yeah, Robert F. Kennedy is obviously a wild card. You have the RNC, the DNC, Biden, and Trump very wary of Kennedy. Not what they all have in common is they do not want Robert F. Kennedy on that debate stage in June or September. And we know that Kennedy has very much been trying to meet that. So the more Kennedy is in the headlines, the more he grows his already relatively high name ID. That definitely heightens the risk of him being on the debate stage. Now, going back to his reaction, it's no secret that Kennedy and Trump share, certain members of their base. There's definitely some overlap there. So if Kennedy were to sort of go back and take the normal, I guess, the run-of-the-mill Democratic response to this, saying no one is above the law, et cetera, he would definitely turn off some members of his base. So this was very calculated. He doesn't want to lose those members of the base that, maybe voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, but, aren't exactly happy with him or are somewhere in the middle on him.
He was also critical of Trump in that statement. So it's going to be interesting to see how he plays it between Biden and Trump throughout the rest of this campaign. Actor Robert De Niro gave his reaction to the verdict, saying yesterday, justice was served. It comes after he said this at a press conference outside the Manhattan courthouse earlier this week.
Donald Trump wants to destroy not only the city, but the country, and eventually he could destroy the world. He wants to sow total chaos, which he's succeeding in some areas and places to do.
Now, because of those comments, the National Association of Broadcasters is denying him an award. What's going on there?
Look, I think the National Association of Broadcasters obviously has ties to philanthropic causes, and they want to keep those causes. They want to be neutral in order to keep getting that money and attracting other people from across the political spectrum. They don't want to be tainted by politics. But, overall, Drew, I think that event with Robert De Niro outside of the courthouse, it sort of shows in the reaction from the National Association of Broadcasters. It shows how big of a misstep this has been for the Biden campaign. I mean, it just seemed like a total fumble on their part, especially at a time when you see the campaign and President Biden himself trying to very, very carefully thread the needle on how they respond to this. But, I thought it was interesting last night, though, looking at my phone, I got a fundraising text from the Biden campaign, and they were invoking who else but Robert De Niro. So clearly in their calculation of all of this, it wasn't that big of a fumble. But for the National Association of Broadcasters, definitely distancing themselves from De Niro. They don't want to appear political.
All right. Thanks so much, Julie. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks.
Joining us now is Senior Director of Emerson College Polling, Matt Taglia. Matt, in a national poll you released recently, you asked people whether the guilty verdict in the New York hush money case would impact their vote in the presidential race. 25% of respondents said a guilty verdict would make them less likely to vote for Trump. How significant is that in a race that's expected to be so close?
It is significant. 25% or a quarter of the vote. That really is something, especially once we start digging into these numbers. But we do have to say 23%, so almost an equal number, so that the conviction actually makes them more likely to support Trump in the end. Now, that said, 29% of undecided voters say that the conviction makes them less likely to support Trump. And also many of these younger voters who we've seen sort of trailing away from Biden in some cases, they seem to be more turned off by the conviction as well. 31% of 18 to 29-year-olds and 22% of 30 to 39-year-olds say that the conviction makes them less likely to back Trump. And as you said, when we've got margins this close nationally, that really could factor into that top line number.
And you also have a new poll from New York that you just released. Something we found interesting there is that only 27% of respondents expected Trump to be found guilty on all counts, which of course he was. If that sentiment is replicated across the country, it seems like the verdict could be a pretty big jolt in the minds of voters.
It could be. And, we don't know exactly what the effects will be. But looking at the New York numbers, we see that Trump voters are actually the ones who are most surprised by these convictions. So 57% of New York Trump voters said that they didn't expect him to be convicted on any charges. Now, the question remains whether this actually influences how they vote in the end. If we go by the national numbers, it looks like they're going to be sticking with him. Only 9% of Trump voters say that a conviction makes it less likely to support him in the end. So, you know, whether this actually has an effect with those Trump voters, we'll see, but it's probably marginal.
Now, that New York poll shows Biden beating Trump 48% to 41%, but in 2020, Biden won New York by almost 25 points. What accounts for Biden's erosion of support in New York, according to your poll, and is that a bad sign for Biden nationally?
Yeah, so it's the same sort of story that we've seen in other states and that we've seen in national polling, where Biden has been losing support among some of his core demographics that he's dependent on in the past, in 2020. So younger voters who are under 40, they aren't backing him with the same enthusiasm in this case in New York State. Biden only wins them by about 15 points. And then minority voters too. Biden wins just over a majority of the Hispanic vote, and his margin with Black voters is lower compared to 2020. Now, we look at partisanship, and Trump is winning independents in New York. That's a little bit of a surprise here. I think that the Biden campaign would certainly be concerned about that. I think that they are going to rely on these voters in the end. That doesn't mean that New York State is necessarily in play, but it does give us an idea and reflects some of the national trends we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's going to be key how this guilty verdict impacts those voters that have strayed away from Biden in November. But Matt Taglia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.